I wanted to just get your opinion on how organisations, and HR in particular, are addressing the problem of regulatory change. So in the UK, we obviously have the reforms to the IR35 legislation, which deem whether somebody is employed or self-employed, and put that responsibility now in the hands of the end hiring organisation, or the paying organisation, effectively. That's coming into play in the UK very shortly. But we've seen similar types of things happening in places like California. If you look at the US 1099 versus W2 laws, there's the movement more towards this type of thing. Seen similar things in various European countries. I would expect governments around the world to take more of this sort of approach, where they're sort of saying, hang on a minute, there's too many grey areas, income taxes slipping through our fingers, and people aren't doing things the right way. We need to get on top of this. But in terms of how you're seeing companies address this, what's your kind of take on that from what you're seeing in the market?
A great question. I mean, undoubtedly, if you go back to first principles, why are governments encouraging this, right? Basically, tax revenues are leaking. And so there is a push in many jurisdictions to increase tax revenues. You throw a global pandemic and all the financial consequence of that, then there's only one direction of travel from what I see, and that's yet more pushing into collecting every single tax dollar that you can legitimately for the right reasons. And there is a perception that the contractor market, I guess, to use the UK definition, is an area where there has been significant tax leakage or missed tax opportunities as far as the HMRC is concerned. So obviously we have the changes to IR35 as you referenced them, and in other jurisdictions, the same theme, the same drivers is causing the same reaction, which will create their version of the same thing. The challenge with IR35, or managing and mitigating IR35, it plays to the very thing that we talked quite a lot about earlier on, which is how good are organizations at strategic workforce planning? And as we know from spending time together on other events, we know that there are business leaders who liked the more flexible use of contractors, because whatever knotty regulatory problem was thrown at them this week, they could throw their contractor resource at that, spend 4 or 5 weeks noodling that, out comes a project, and then they throw that same contractor, because they've got a set of generic skills, onto the next problem. And you know, I spent a lot of time in banking, and contractors were a significant part of the resource deployed to address post-global financial crisis remediation, along with the big consultancies. A lot of resource and a lot of cost was spent on remediating either data, files, processes, or technology to make banking more secure and stable for the future according to the changes in regulation. So then to go back a bit narrower to the question, I guess, that you're really asking, which is, you know, how good are functional responsibilities in readiness for some of these changes? I guess there's two perspectives. One is these changes aren't always terribly clear when they're first announced. So there's a lot of guesswork goes on. And IR35, it was weird because I was involved in a bit of IR35 planning in a previous life. And we had this weird situation where everybody in the market was saying, we're not quite sure what HMRC would do. Yet they'd introduced exactly the same regulations to the public sector 3 years before. So, you know, as I was saying to a lot of people, well, maybe they're just going to do that because that's what they've already done in public sector. So, you know, as always, what can we learn from the public sector? And to an extent we couldn't, and to an extent we couldn't. And because it plays back onto this, how good is business in articulating the very clear demand, and how good is HR and others functions in supporting that demand, and then thinking about resource solutions to solve for it. And so that whole kind of IR35 contractor debate has become a bit of a catalyst for the broader conversation about strategic workforce planning. And it's a driver for better conversations for that. How prepared are organizations? I think everybody will get through it. They'll noodle their way through it. It won't be perfect. But you know, things think the rule is coming in. It's what, 3 weeks away now, or 2.5 weeks away. So organizations will have to finally, you know, get over the challenges they had. And there's undoubtedly, without naming, you know, culprits, there are undoubtedly really good examples of just why HMRC are tightening the legislation here, because, you know, there are many examples in firms that I have seen where contractors have been around in organizations more than 5 years, more than 6 years, more than 7 years, more than 8 years, which by anybody's definition of contractor is not a contractor. So it's a healthy challenge to business to sort out its practices in terms of resource management and resource planning, about, you know, statements of works and articulating what's required at the outset. And you can see the purpose of it. Hopefully organizations will come to a settled point in managing it over the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, as you say, it's very much a catalyst. It's a very strong catalyst in the market for people to address. It's forcing them to address this specific issue. You know, the use of contractors isn't going to go away. It's just got to be done via a set of rules. I was almost going to say then a specific set of rules, but actually there's a lot of grey areas, which is one of the reasons people have, you know, one of the things that people have found very tricky about it. But, you know, the use of contractors is not going to go away. It just needs to be managed more closely. Pardon me. And it has made organisations address more widely, well, what other ways are there of getting work done, and how are we getting work done at the moment, which is, you know, raises the important point of addressing, before you even think about how you're going to resource something, what is it you need to get done, and then what's the most effective way to resource that. Whereas I think, you know, in a lot of cases already, people will automatically just be thinking about headcount without even assessing what the outcome might need to be. And there can be maybe a slightly lax attitude to, as you say, if contractors are sat there for a very, very long period of time, what are they actually doing? What are they actually delivering? And actually, from an organization's point of view, is it really that effective to just have this resource model that is based on very woolly objectives? Ties into this very center point of our discussion around objectives and where you want to get to.
And who manages them as well, I think, Johnny, because I still think, you know, HR is very clearly seen as owning the employee value proposition, if you will, with lots of inputs and supports from business. But HR is really the function that's looking at employed people. Consultants tend to be owned by the business with lots of good support from procurement. These contractor population, who actually owns them? And historically, one of the reasons why contractors stayed for so long is because it was the easiest solution for everybody involved. You know, procurement just had a template, a single person or, you know, a private company template, rolled it out 50 times, that was done. HR didn't really get involved and didn't really want to get involved because, you know, if we start talking about contractors with the function that looks after employees, then we're starting to do the risks about the legislation, you know, hidden employment is trying to address in the first place. They should be employees. And then on the other side, you've got the operational world going, well, you know, it's procurement, it's HR, it's everybody else. It's not me that's owning this population. So I think contractors were a wee bit like left out there, and then, you know, you've got a technology function that was using that resource predominantly more than anybody else in many organizations. And so they see it as their resource, but not really wanting to get their hands dirty in the operational challenges of it. And I certainly saw that in the IR35 planning, trying to bring together operations, technology, who was a big demand user there, HR, procurement, finance, just trying to get everybody into one shape was the biggest challenge I had for the first 3 or 4 months, trying to just noodle everybody together to make sure that they cooperated and worked together well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty complex and tricky strategic issue for a lot of companies I know that are kind of grappling with it at the moment. I have to hope that in the spirit of optimism, some positive changes come out of it, in the sense of, you know, maybe better permanent opportunities for people that maybe if the permanent opportunities were better, they wouldn't want to be a contractor anyway. But also for the people that want to be a contractor and work through their own limited company, clearer objectives, maybe potentially even more fulfillment around what they're actually delivering. And maybe it will cause people to increase their portfolio, and for companies to facilitate contractors to increase their portfolio, and just, really, really clear working practices, maybe where in the past things have been put upon contractors that probably shouldn't be put upon contractors because they're not rewarded in the same way as a permanent employee, and they don't get the benefits that a permanent employee might have. And therefore they've been asked to do things that maybe aren't necessarily appropriate, which possibly could be caught by some of the rules around IR35. And then from a business point of view, the business clearly assessing what are they doing, what are the objectives, what are the options of how they can get that work done, and how they can most effectively go and do it. Where, you mentioned statement of work, be it as a work delivery model, people are addressing that more now, but they should have been addressing it anyway, because it's not the be all and end all, but it's a way of getting work done that is going to be most suited to particular areas, where the other areas are going to be most suited to hiring a contractor. Other areas are going to be best delivered under a permanent resource. So it's forcing companies to clear that up. I think the potential kind of downsides, which hopefully will only be in the short term, is where people are making really blanket decisions, and which is effectively almost saying it's too much of a thorny issue to try and solve directly. But I think that ties into, I can understand why some businesses might feel in that position, particularly if they're in, in an area which forces you to be particularly risk averse. But I think in having to solve these problems, hopefully there are some potential positive outcomes that will arise from it.
I do agree with your optimism. One note of caution, and the note of caution is too often, particularly in quota companies, permanent headcount is used as an indicator of both past and future cost. And many organizations, when they present to the market, as you know, as well as I do, they'll talk about FTE and permanent headcount as a lever in terms of an indicator of just how much and how serious an organization is about cost management. So when we were talking about, IR35 launches in 2.5 weeks' time, there's part of me that says the worst year you could ever bring that rule in is the one that is marked the year after the major global pandemic, and the one where all the financial chickens come home to roost for many organizations. Right. At the time when, I like your optimism, at the time when you would hope the legislation will drive in, let's turn quite a lot of these contractors to the permanent employers they always should have been. The problem with that is it will take up FTE. And no CFO or CEOs want to go into the market and say, by the way, we borrowed all that money on that bond over the next 5 years and made some very strong promises financially to the market that we can afford it. We're just going to increase our FTE by, 8% in the next 6 months. No CFO, CEO is going to do that. So because we've got this weird thing in quoted markets where FTE is seen as a quasi cost, even though you and I know actually quite often a contractor in total cost management terms is much more expensive than a permanent employee to the organization. So even allowing for the tax that you need to pay. So I like the optimism. I agree with most of the optimism. My note of caution is that the behavioral pattern of the way that we manage permanent FTE in the past also needs to change. We need to get a bit better at talking about real cost, the total resource cost, not here's our FTE numbers, and the fact we spend 400 million on contractors and consultants every year is sitting down on page 28 of the notes. The FTE you'll read quite early on, and it's a behavioral thing that we've all got into, and we need to kind of step back a wee bit because it's actually not telling the market the right piece of information in the first place anyway. But the total picture is hard to tell, which is why we don't do it, and it goes back to how we started this conversation, which is the total picture is really hard to get.
That is such an interesting point. I really hadn't considered it from that angle. And it highlights the fact of how some companies probably feel quite snookered at the moment, with all of these things going on and all of these different pressures to try and solve all these problems at once. And like you say, it's all of the chickens coming home to roost at the same time. That's a fascinating point. But again, with my kind of possible blatant over-optimism, maybe that could be a catalyst for positive change, in the sense of organizations having to get more transparency on, what are we doing at the moment? What are we spending on? A lot of organizations are concerned about risk in their procurement tail spend, where they might have disguised contractors or even, disguised employment stuff going on within their tail spend of statement of work, for example, hidden kind of below procurement thresholds that's maybe not really managed effectively. We're seeing a lot of that type of conversation coming out at the moment. But if you gain visibility on all of these areas, you're going to take a better approach to looking after your employees and valuing your employees for what the company is delivering. And you're also going to have more recognition of the different options you have to get work done and how effective they are. You might have some areas, ways in which an organization is getting work done, which are massively wasteful, but because they're not identified, because again, people are working to the rule book, there's a headcount freeze, therefore I'll do it this way. Those sort of things, the pandemic is going to force people to have to address that cultural setup. But clearly, as you say, there's going to be pushback from that, because that's the way that people have operated for many years, and that's their approach to it. I think it's going to be a fascinating time, and it's going to be very interesting to see how companies adapt. But there are various things in play in the market that should allow companies to adapt faster. And as I say, if they're able to offer better permanent employees, if they can get permanent options and they can get over that hurdle, then that's going to be really, people are going to feel valued. People are going to have better opportunities, like say, who maybe would trend towards actually wanting to go perm if the opportunity was good enough. And for the really, the contractors who want to stay as contractors, many of them are hugely valuable resource that company is really going to struggle to do without. So they need to recognize them more, treat them in the right way, and make the effort to maintain the service delivery that they want to be getting from these areas of expertise, but doing it in a compliant manner, which maybe they've been able to kind of just not really have to bother about before. But yeah, it's the fact that we've got this regulatory change happening in the UK, plus the backdrop of the pandemic, and then you throw Brexit in there, it's a hugely challenging and interesting situation. And different people are taking knee jerks in different directions. I definitely think overall it is driving the recognition of outsourcing, because it's seen as an alternative to other work delivery models. And with things like Brexit, the kind of access to talent aspect of it, I think is possibly going to drive that outsourcing model as well. But the bottom line is it's already massive, and it's not really been effectively addressed. So the change you'll see in it is just the icing on the cake of this giant underlying problem. And as you say, it's unearthing problems around the way that contractors are engaged, and it's unearthing problems around the way that permanent employees are considered and recognized within an organization, and very nicely ties back to our original point about the overall objectives and direction and this key of the strategic workforce plan. So I think there's some hugely interesting kind of challenges and times ahead of us.